Hello everybody and welcome to another online lesson, this time in the Nazi Germany course with the topic of how did the Nazis control religious views. This is a topic that I think a lot of us find quite difficult. Maybe some people find it a little bit boring, tedious maybe. So hopefully going through this a little bit slower in your own time online as a revision video if you're in year 11 or if you're watching it for the first time because you missed the lesson. Hopefully it'll help just to break it down a little bit. So before we do get into religion in this lesson, let's just put a little bit of context to this. Where does this fit into our whole Nazi course? All right, so we're talking here in the spec about control and influence. How did the Nazis control and influence society 1933 onwards? All right, so after they get into power. And we've seen the terror, the police state, how they did that using fear, the SD, the SS, the Gestapo, the law courts and the camps. So that would be maybe perhaps one element of control. Propaganda, as we've seen as well. Not propaganda to get elected, remember, but propaganda once they're in power to brainwash people. So the media, the newspaper, the Sturmer, the radio, the rallies, sport with the Olympic Stadium, architecture, power and permanence, the arts, cinema, and of course films like The Eternal Jew. So with terror and propaganda, that's a huge part in how they control society during their reign. But of course a third little part of that, and a massive part of that, would be religion. If they can control religion, then of course I think they can probably control most things, which is what brings us on to this lesson today. So we're going to focus now on just religion. So let's get cracking. How did the Nazis control religious views from 1933 onwards? So this online lesson is going to be in three parts. So the spec is a little bit awkward in this case on this Nazi Germany religious element. In the spec, it puts in just control of religion separately with, as we've seen, terror and propaganda. But then opposition to religion is further down in the spec as a slightly different thing, looking at opposition from religion, religious groups and the youth and any other opposition. In this lesson, we're going to merge the two. So we're going to have how they tried to control religion and what opposition they faced. And the reason for that is so we can have a little go at a part 3. Add a little bit of exam focus into the end of this video as a section B. What might this religion be as section B? Talking to my students in my class, whenever you mention the idea of religion being section B, everyone goes a little bit green. So hopefully after watching this video, you'll see that it's not too bad. In actual fact, any topic that we get with section B, even if it's one that we love or one that we don't love, as long as we remember the technique and the script, there's plenty of information in the sources and the interpretations that we can still do pretty well at. So at the end of this lesson, hopefully that'll make sense and you'll have a chance to have a little go at one of the paragraphs and then obviously get that marked. Okay, so let's get started. Just thinking about what Hitler's saying here in this quote. He says, neither Catholic nor Protestant has any future left, at least not for the Germans. Nothing will stop me stamping out Christianity in Germany, root and branch. One is either a Christian or a German. You can't be both. Do you really believe the masses will ever be Christians again? Nonsense. Never again. No one will listen to it again, but we can hasten matters. That means speed it up. The clergy will be made to dig their own graves. They will betray their God to us. They will betray anything for the sake of the miserable little jobs and incomes. So a very powerful start to this topic. To me, there's no doubt how Hitler views religion. But before we move on, just pause this video and answer this question here. Looking at this little speech, what are Hitler's views about religion? Summarise the points he's trying to make, maybe 3 points, and then when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll carry on. Okay, so what are the main disagreements here? Let's have a little look at what the Nazis believe compared to what Christianity teaches. The Nazis say that strength and violence is the only way forward, including creating a perfect Aryan, racially pure state. There's no room for the weak. Hitler is godlike in every way. But the teachings of the church are tolerance, love, peace, forgiveness, and respect for all people is the way forward. We must always help the weak, as our one true God has asked. So again, just to get us into some sort of context for this religion, if you are religious, then it might be a little bit easier. But for most people, they're not religious necessarily. So just pause the video and work out what the main differences here are. And this is actually quite a useful bit of practice for the obviously section B. And when you're ready with that, just unpause and we'll carry on into some content. Okay, so what was religion like in Nazi Germany? It's important to know these facts that 2/3 of Germany is Protestant and 1/3 of Germany is Catholic. So the vast majority of people in the early 1930s are religious, pretty much like every other country in Europe at the time. So why do you think this might be a problem? What is this problem if 2/3 are Protestant, 1/3 are Catholic? Firstly, as a negative problem, have a little think, and then obviously I'll tell you in a sec. All right, so perhaps you might have thought that this would be a lot of people that Hitler would have to control, particularly the Catholic Church, because as we'll see in a minute, the Catholic Church, the people, the Catholics, they are loyal to one person in particular on earth, obviously underneath God, and that's the Pope. And as we've just heard Hitler saying in that little speech, you cannot be loyal to both. So this could be a problem for the Nazis, is because their loyalty is more to what the Pope says than to what Hitler says. Whereas 2/3 of the country being Protestant, again, there's going to be a larger amount of Germans who are going to be more loyal to their pastors or their religious leaders or God rather than Hitler. So Hitler clearly does have a problem. He's got to deal with this. So what does he do? What do the Nazis do in terms of trying to control these people? So firstly, as it all started in 1933, actually the Nazis tried to reassure the churches. They tried to get them on side before they would do any of the sort of terror that we've seen already. And this source kind of gives us a bit of a hint about what's going on here. So he says during the Enabling Act speech in 1933 that Christianity is the unshakable foundation of the moral and ethical life of our people. The national government's concern, so that's the Nazi government, will be for the cooperation of the church with the state. It expects, however, that this will meet with similar appreciation from their side. So just pause the video perhaps and have a little, see if you can work out what he's trying to say in this speech about the relationship with the church, because what he's saying in this speech in the Reichstag is very different to that speech that we've just read a second ago. When you're ready, unpause the video, come back, and we'll carry on with what the Nazis did. Okay, so welcome back. So the second thing they would do is they encourage them to work with the Nazi party, and it says that at the bottom of this source, doesn't it? That the state, although we see that the church is important, it must work with us. And obviously, if it doesn't, then we're going to see some of the same situations that other people see if they oppose the Nazis. So overall, source H is quite a good source, quite a powerful source in giving us the view of Hitler. The fact that he says it during the Enabling Act speech brings a little bit of context to that and some own knowledge. If this ever was an opportunity to talk about this source, and of course Hitler's saying it himself, but you know that's the view of the Nazis. Maybe if this was a section B and this was a source, then you know that the other source would be more aggressive, perhaps, against the church, similar to maybe the first speech that he gave. All right, so that's the first bit of the story. But then, as you can imagine, with the Nazis, and as what we know already from this Nazi course, this positive sort of working together didn't last very long, and he very quickly did turn the police state onto the church. More so the Catholic Church probably, but also any opposition within his own Protestant church. Okay, so that is where we are. That's the starting point of this. So now let's get our head around the two different churches. If you're watching this as revision in year 11 and you've done the Elizabeth course, then obviously you'll be aware of the Protestant and Catholic Church breakdown in that course too. So there's always been this divide between the two arms of Christianity, if you like. It goes way back and it's right up into the 20th century as well. So I think your note should be, in this case, to do Protestant opposition or Protestant, how the Nazis dealt with the Protestants first, maybe split a page, and then a second half of the page, how they did the Catholics, okay? And that's how we present this. So let's start looking at some sources, and the only reason to look at sources is to consider practice, okay? So this first source on the left is a Nazi poster from 1933, and it's showing the swastika knocking out the Catholics and the communists. So do you think that source is about this positive relations and working together? Hopefully you can see that it's quite aggressive, isn't it? It's threatening to get rid of the communists and the Catholics, which more supports Hitler's first speech at the very beginning of this online lesson. So hopefully we can see a bit of practice there that we could match up to that speech, to this one, as if this was a section B and you're matching up a source to an interpretation, which we'll have a little look at later on in this lesson. And then the other source that we're looking at is an extract from the Oath of Allegiance, which is a promise of loyalty to the Nazi regime sworn by some German Catholic bishops. in 1933. So again, we're probably seeing in this source that right at the beginning of Hitler's reign in 1933, the Catholic bishops were loyal. They swore this oath of loyalty to Hitler and the Nazis, which might surprise you. Maybe it doesn't. And it says, "In my spiritual office for the welfare and interest of the German Reich, I will endeavour, or try really hard, to avoid all detrimental acts which might endanger it." In other words, what they're saying in this oath is that they are obviously going to support the Nazi regime, and they're going to try and make sure that their religious beliefs don't in any way come into conflict with that. I don't know if they're maybe forced to say this, or they think that if they say this following Hitler's olive branch, if you like, in that source we've just seen in the Enabling Act, that the Catholics think, okay, we'll just play the game, very probably similar to how the Catholics did under Elizabeth when she passed the religious settlement, that outwardly they sort of played the game a little bit, but in their own areas. But they've promised here to not let their religion interfere with the state. Okay, so we've got these two nice sources to start us off here. Clearly both different views. One's aggressive from the Nazi perspective to get rid of the Catholics, and the other one is showing the Catholics in support. And obviously we put those things together with interpretations if that was the case. All right, so haven't just spoken about it, maybe just pause the video and write in your notes what you can work out from these sources. Consider this maybe as a question 1 in your exam, so the inference question. What can you infer, or give 2 inferences from this source or the second source about Nazis' attitudes towards religion, or Nazi opposition to religion? And obviously you could say, if we do the second little one for a little practice while we're here, I can infer from this source that there wasn't much opposition from the Catholics, and I can tell this because it says, in my office, blah blah blah, I will avoid all detrimental acts. Just quote that source really. And the other one we could maybe say, I can infer from the picture that attitudes and relations were pretty poor at the start of the Nazis' reign towards religion. This is because the picture shows Hitler or the Nazis promising to knock out the Catholics and the communists. So there's a nice little practice while we're doing this lesson of question 1. The inference question, remember, is always good because it's just what you think, just what you can see or what you work out, as long as it relates to the question. Make sure you're always relating to those questions. All right, so the first thing the Nazis have done really, well, early on in the reign, as you can see, 1935, so about 2 years into the reign, is they set up the Ministry of Church Affairs. Now, we know from our propaganda lessons that they have ministries for everything: ministry for art, ministry for music, ministry for cinema, ministry of propaganda. So they have ministries of everything in order to control these things and allow what is produced or published has been approved by the Nazis. So they set up this thing in 1935 in an attempt to weaken the hold of the Catholic and Protestant churches on the people. So this kind of thing that we're talking about now, this might be a good bit of old knowledge for you in the section B, if ever this was the case, where you can say that perhaps the Nazis were a little bit more aggressive towards the churches, and you'd bring up this as your own knowledge. They set up this ministry to control the two, both Catholic and Protestant, which ultimately will help them control the people. So let's break this down first with our Catholics, how they dealt with the Catholics first. All right, doesn't matter if you put in your notes Protestant or Catholic first, because you've got this in a split page. Okay, so the first thing to remember is that 1/3 of Germany are Catholic. There's a lot of people with a loyalty to somebody else other than Hitler. So the Catholics owed their allegiance first to the Pope rather than Hitler. And this is exactly the same situation if you've done the Elizabeth course, and even if you are watching this from a different school and you've done Henry VIII, you'll know that the people had this split loyalty to their monarch and to their Pope. So Hitler said a person was either Christian or German, not both. We've seen that in the early part of this lesson. And the Catholics also have their own schools, just like we have Catholic schools today, which teach their own values from the Nazi schools. So if you're a kid who's going to a Nazi school, you're getting all the right information, all the propaganda, all the brainwashing, and you're becoming a Nazi. But if you're a child who's going to a Catholic school, then of course you're missing out on the Nazi indoctrination. That's a problem for the Nazis, isn't it? Because that means there's a lot of children who are not being, I suppose, brainwashed into being a Nazi. So that's going to be an issue later on. Hopefully this first little bit makes sense. Just summarize these bullet points into your notes. And that's quite clear why they need to deal with the Catholics, isn't it? All right. So this is the most important bit, really, of the relationship, the Nazis' relationship with the Catholics. And you have to know this. There's no getting away from the fact that you can sort of fluff your way around this one. You've got to know the Concordat. All right, so Concordat just means an agreement in July. So about 6 months into Hitler's reign, when he becomes Chancellor in January 30th. So July here, the Concordat. And this is essentially where there's an agreement. So some positive relations that might be useful knowledge for you to support a positive source, perhaps, in a source question. So I know that. So Hitler has confirmed freedom of worship for Catholics and that he's not going to interfere with Catholic schools, which 6 months into his reign, that's quite a promising relationship, I suppose. And then he also says, on the one condition that the Catholic Church agrees that its priests would not interfere in politics and order the German bishops to swear loyalty to the Nazis. Now, as we've seen in the previous source, just a little bit earlier in this lesson, they did have that oath to the Nazis, didn't they? So the Concordat, this agreement, is really positive. This is great. Everything looks like it's good. Hitler's going to leave them to do their thing, and the Catholics are going to stay out of Hitler's business. I wonder if you think that's going to last for very long. The reality is probably not. And if you're watching this as Year 11 doing revision, then of course you know that relationship didn't go very well and didn't last very long. And hopefully this is going to remind you of some of the key knowledge that you need for that bit. All right, so they don't is the answer to that as we go into the 1930s, and we'll see as this lesson progresses into what they're doing. So how they're dealing with it as the 30s goes on, it becomes clear that Hitler was not going to keep his promises to the Pope. So that Concordat almost wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Maybe we've seen that before with the appeasement of Neville Chamberlain, that what Hitler says and what Hitler does are often two very different things. So very quickly as the 1930s progresses, the Catholic priests start being harassed and arrested. Many of them end up in these concentration camps that we've already talked about, haven't we, in the police state lessons. Catholic schools are brought in line with state schools or closed altogether. So that thing that we've just talked about where the Nazis will be worried about the influences on German children going to Catholic schools as opposed to the Nazi schools, well, problem solved. They've closed them down. And in 1935, the Catholic Youth League, this youth group for Catholics and other religious groups were being attacked by the Hitler Youth groups. And then, of course, they were banned because if children are going to the religious and Christian groups, they're not going to the Hitler Youth groups. Obviously, that goes without saying, doesn't it? But the fact that they've had to do these things suggests that perhaps they're not controlling the Catholics as much as they thought they would, or as much as they wanted to. So this is good examples and good evidence, again, with Section B in mind, as good evidence for how they obviously weren't able to control them, so they had to come to these quite extreme measures to do it. All right, so these kids, these young kids who are off to the Catholic youth groups are getting beaten up by Hitler Youth kids. And it's just a bit of a mess, really. All right, so you might understand that if you do attend church and maybe you go to your young Bible groups or whatever, that you might see some Hitler Youth kids giving you a lot of grief as you go. All right. They also then closed down monasteries, and they cite the perversions in the monasteries, very similar to Henry VIII and how he did. Says that the monks are all perverts, they're greedy, and he cites a lot of homosexuality within the monasteries. So he shuts them down. And of course, just like in Tudor times, the monasteries are an important aspect for people's lives, especially Catholics, for support, food, all sorts of spiritual nurturing, and maybe some guidance in their life. So that's gone. So Hitler here has really took that Concordat and ripped it up into a million pieces. And then, of course, Goebbels' propaganda campaign very quickly turns against the Catholic Church. So that might come as a surprise to you from the first bit of this lesson, or it might not. It probably shouldn't, knowing the Nazis as we do. But very quickly, the Concordat has ended, and the Nazis are clearly up against, or at war, if you like, with the Catholics within Germany. But that shouldn't be a surprise to you. So this picture that we can see here is one of the more famous sources to prove this propaganda, and it's from Der Stürmer. So as we know, that's the Nazi newspaper that they, pushed their propaganda, their anti-Semitic ideas, in May 1938, and it says the Jewish devil feeds criticisms of the Nazi regime to Catholic priests. In other words, the devil is the Jew, the devil, all of it really is sort of turning the Catholics against the Nazis, and the Catholics are now evil, and they've been sort of brainwashed by the Jewish devil, and now we need to do something about it. So the Catholics have turned bad. In other words, the Catholics turned against us, not us against the Catholics, because they were influenced by the Jewish devil. Now, of course, that's propaganda today. As we're watching this and doing this lesson, we can see the propaganda, we understand it, but at the time that really will have worked quite well to start turning some of the Germans against the Catholic Church, which is really what Hitler needs, isn't it? Divide and conquer is how they do all of this. All right, so just a little summary then of what we've done. That's the Catholic bit done. Just pause the video and have a look at this nice little image just to make sure you've understood what we talked about in this lesson, the sort of flow chart of events, if you like. Make sure your notes include those things, and make sure you understand and start to be thinking about whether you think the Nazis have been successful in how they've dealt with the Catholics, influenced or controlled them, and if you don't. And it might be useful in your notes, however you're doing this on a Google Doc or in your book, to maybe now rule off a bit of your Catholic section and say successfully dealt with or not successfully dealt with. And of course, that's going to help you with section B, if ever that was the case, looking at one interpretation that says they dealt with the Catholics well, and one interpretation that says that they didn't. When you're ready, unpause the video and we'll carry on and look at the Protestants. All right, so number 2 today, how did they deal with the Protestants? Remember, 2/3 of the Protestants of Germany are Protestant, sorry. So initially, the Protestants are quite supportive of the Nazis. That might surprise you. The main reason for this is because they hated the Treaty of Versailles, much like every other German citizen, and they were also very anti-communist. And I suppose in a way, it's more that they're worried about how anti-religious the communists are, rather than anti-communist. But of course that goes hand in hand, that they hate the communists and the communists hate religion. So they're very worried about this communist element of Germany. As we've said, 2/3 of Germany are Protestants. So at first, most Germans and most Protestants were grateful that Hitler won the election, not the Protestants. Hitler is seen as this sort of hero, protected them from the anti-Christian communists. So they were willing to work with the Nazis. And keeping in mind, just going backwards to Tudor times, that the Protestant religion started in Germany with Martin Luther. So perhaps there is that element deep down of the Protestant religion being much more state-like than perhaps the Catholics, who are loyal to the Pope, of course, which is in a different country and controlled with Catholics all over the whole entire world. The power of the Pope in that sense, just to quickly go back, cannot be underestimated. Obviously, if the Pope tells all Catholics to invade Germany, there's 1 billion Catholics around the world that Hitler would need to deal with. So in that sense, the Catholics are a bit more dangerous potentially to the Nazis than the Protestants are. All right, so that's a bit of background to the Protestant religion in this country. And then this source, I'm going to spend a bit more time with this source later on in a little section B practice, but we can have a look straight away from this statement from a German Protestant church leader. So a Protestant in June 1937. So we've been in power for a long time now, the Nazis. So maybe this source would suggest to you that they haven't quite faced the same wrath of the Nazis as the Catholics did. So this church leader says, we all know that if the Third Reich were to collapse, the communists would come into its place. So we must show loyalty to the Führer, who has saved us from the communists and given us a better chance. So this is 3 years in, and they're still going on about this fear of communism as to why they voted for the Nazis. And that does link, doesn't it, to our Rise of Hitler lesson, where a lot of people voted for the Nazis, not because they liked the Nazis, it's just that they were very much afraid of the communists. And maybe that's where we are with some of these Protestants as well. So we'll spend some time with this source at the end of this lesson, but just have a little look at this image about how this Protestant church is going to look. It's obviously going to be Nazified. Everything is Nazified, isn't it? So we've got the new Reich Church is what it's called, with the Reich minister. He obviously has his Nazi uniform. The church has got the swastika all over it. The Bible has probably been replaced or distorted or changed with Nazi teachings. And obviously the symbol of this Reich Church changes from the cross to that. So in essence, it's still a Protestant church, but the new church that Hitler sets up, or these Protestants set up, is the Reich Church. So straight away we can see an absolute difference in the two religions. The Catholics signed the Concordat very early on, thinking that they were going to be able to work with the Nazis, but very quickly they realized that they couldn't, and it fell apart, and the Nazis brutally attacked them. Whereas here we are at the start of the relationship with the Protestants, and we can see that they've set up a new Nazified Protestant church, the Reich Church, and this source tells us that many Protestants, especially leaders, supported the Nazis. So that's a definite difference of the two sides. Let's see how this develops as we go through the next little bit. All right, so the new Reich Church then that they set up in 1936, it's led by a guy called Ludwig Müller, a Reich bishop, and all of the people in this Reich Church have to be Nazis, essentially, like the teachers have to be Nazis and all those things. So only pastors who continue to support Hitler's views were allowed to provide any services, just so they can't say anything anti-Nazi. Some even allowed swastikas to be displayed, as we've just seen in that image. And an interesting thing about the new Reich Church is that Jews are now not allowed to be baptized into the Christian faith. Before they could. Whereas now what they're saying is, in this Reich Church, that Jews cannot convert to Christianity anymore. There's obviously anti-Semitic reasons for that. And all the Jewish teachings from the Old Testament were removed from the services. So essentially what they've done is they've taken religion, they've sort of cleaned it up a little bit so it suits what the Nazis want to teach. It's a Nazi version, shall we say Protestant light, with more Nazi influence than perhaps Bible influence. So that's the Reich Church, and obviously it's going to have lots of members. We know lots of people are clearly anti-communist, so might continue to go to this church. Maybe people would go to this church because of fear. Maybe people will go to this church because they genuinely believe in this church. But it sounds like, doesn't it, and it seems like that the Nazis and the Protestants are getting on far better than the Nazis and the Catholics. So, opposition. Now remember that we're talking about opposition in this course is going to be more so part of opposition from the church, from religion, from young people, and maybe just from people generally. So keep that in mind as you're watching this video, that we are putting the two together in this lesson, but you'll need to consider religion and opposition as a separate entity as well. Clearly you'll have learnt it all, so it just means in that exam you need to make sure that you figure out, is this about just opposition, or is this about how the Nazis tried to control them? This lesson is a bit more confusing in that sense because we're going to do both together. All right, so how did some Protestants oppose the Nazis? And that should get you thinking straight away that so far in this lesson, it seems that the Nazis and the Protestants have gone quite well. So why would there be opposition? But of course, not everybody is a Nazi and wants to be a Nazi. So not all Protestants accepted this Nazi state and not accepted this Reich Church. Few spoke out, actively spoke out. They preached against the Nazi regime and the Nazi Reich Church, and they created this PEL, the Pastors Emergency League. So now essentially where we're going to go down in this little bit of your notes is that our Protestant church is now going to split into two. So Pastor Niemöller, who we'll spend a little bit of time with in a minute, is probably one of the most famous religious figures of the 20th century. He sets up this new Protestant church, the Confessional Church, which goes against the Reich Church. So now if you're a Protestant in Germany, Nazi Germany, you've got a choice. Do you go to the Reich Church, the Nazi church, or do you go to this new confessional church, which is basically what your church used to be before the Nazis took over? So this confessional church, as an element of opposition, was against the Nazi actions, believing the Reich Church was more about Nazism than Christianity, which now meant that there were two churches. And I think we can clearly see, having just discussed that they've changed the services and changed the Bible, that Niemöller is correct, that this Reich Church is definitely more interested in promoting Nazism than it is to promoting Christianity. So the Reich Church allowed the Nazis to have a say in how it was run, whereas this new confessional church absolutely did not. So your job now, as we're looking at this bit of this lesson, is to fully understand, however you do it in your notes, pictures, dual coding, or just write with asterisks and underline and highlight or whatever, that this is opposition to the Nazi church. And obviously we need to then consider later on, was this church successful, or were the Nazis successful in putting this opposition down? But this is a great example that you would need to include in any source question or interpretations question where you can bring in some more knowledge about absolute Nazi opposition. All right, and these are just great facts just to show this. 6,000 people joined the new confessional church, or essentially their old church, and only 2,000 left in the Reich Church. So quite clearly, Niemöller, his new church and its opposition is going to be a problem for the Nazis, okay? They've taken masses of their members, So now the Nazis are losing influence even in the Protestants as well. And those figures there are really useful for you to include. So Niemöller also opposed this idea that only Aryans can become pastors in the Reich Church. Another one of those laws that the Reich Church come up with, like not allowing them to convert to Christianity. You have to be Aryan to be a pastor, so you have to be a blonde pastor. Niemöller opposes that. He's obviously a religious guy, and he's obviously not very pro-Nazi. All right? It's interesting whether or not we think that Niemöller is anti-Nazi or just very pro-religion. I suppose it's a bit grey, a bit murky, that idea as an argument. He's definitely anti-Nazi influence in his church, isn't he? So either way, he's fighting hard and he's going out there and he's risking his life by basically talking against the Nazis. In 1937, as a result, Niemöller is sent to a concentration camp, as all political prisoners are. Anyone who goes against or speaks against the regime, we know that from the terror lesson, don't we, the police state. So he goes to a camp and he's in and out. He's always getting in trouble and he's always getting arrested. And in total, and again, a really lovely fact for you to have in your flashcards or however you organise your facts, that about 800 pastors were sent to camps in total, which shows us that the Nazis were dealing with the opposition they faced in their typical brutal way, but really good information that you can include, or facts rather, that you can include for your evidence. All right, so that's part one, I suppose, and part two of opposition from the Protestants. So further-wise, this is the most famous, I suppose, opposition. And you may have heard this poem if you're watching this for the first time, and obviously if you're watching this as revision for year 11, then you definitely have heard this poem when we did it in class. Niemöller came up with this poem, and it's become one of the most famous links to Nazi Germany and protest and opposition, but it also has been used in lots of different ways ever since. People have amended this poem or sort of adapted it a little bit. So what Niemöller says as he's delivering this speech to his church on a Sunday is, first they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. So just have a little reflection, have a bit of time with this poem. Really powerful poem and really important poem. What is Niemöller saying? Pause the video and just write in your opinion what you think Niemöller is saying in this poem. All right, when you're ready, unpause and we'll carry on. All right, so welcome back. Hopefully you've figured out there that the idea of what Niemöller is trying to say here is that we all need to step up now. We all need to call out this Nazi regime, this evil regime, that we need to step up as a country, as different people, because eventually, if we don't, they're going to get rid of everybody and there'll be no one to come and save you. That's what he's preaching here, which is utterly brave, utterly stupid, you may say, in the regime, and as we know, the terror. So that is absolutely powerful stuff, and hopefully if you didn't get that, you understand what I'm trying to say now. This is what he's preaching every week, and quite clearly to the Nazis this is dangerous, isn't it? He is a dangerous voice. So again, before we move on to a little bit of Catholic opposition, this is a summary of Niemöller's story. Just have a little read of that. I don't suppose you'll ever need to tell this story about what Niemöller did, but it will just give you a little bit of background to who he is as a man and how he was willing to fight against the Nazi regime. Interestingly, when we say he was sent to camps, he was lucky enough to survive the camps because he was in a camp after the war finished. So in that sense, he's a bit luckier than the people we're going to talk about in a minute. All right, so when you've read that and you're quite happy with Niemöller's story, we'll be able to move on. All right, so this guy is another really important religious man. This is a guy called Bonhoeffer. They've just made a movie about him. You may have seen it. It's probably on Netflix or something soon, if not already. A couple of years ago, they made this movie about this hero, this anti-Nazi hero. You know, a little bit of the sort of ilk of like Schindler and that, although Schindler was a Nazi. Every now and then we come up against these heroes who, in their way, went against the regime. So Bonhoeffer supports Niemöller and set up this confessional church with him. And he preached against the persecutions, believing it was his religious duty to speak out against these persecutions of the Jews, the Gypsies, the T4 program, all those things that we've talked about. He saw it as his duty to say, this is wrong, this can't be happening, this must stop. But of course, he's going against the Nazis, which means he's going to get in trouble. So in 1937, Bonhoeffer was banned from preaching, which is his job, but he still secretly helps the Jews escape Germany. Like I say, hero, massive hero. And I suppose this is why they've made a movie of him. Don't think it'll take you long to find this movie. Just put in Netflix Bonhoeffer or Nazi stuff, and all the movies come up. But it'll be there for you to see if you haven't already. Probably about 2 years ago it came out, 2023, I think. In 1944, Bonhoeffer was sent to a concentration camp where even within the camp he was preaching against the Nazis, and eventually he was hanged by the SS in 1945. So his demise is probably inevitable, unlike Niemöller, who seemed to be lucky in that sense. But this Bonhoeffer is just an example that you can bring in about opposition to the Nazis. Clearly, I don't know if he was very successful. Maybe you could argue, depending on how you view in this whole thing, that the Nazi, the way they dealt with it was very good, very effective. There wasn't really that big a deal. They stopped him. Although by 1945 he was still alive and still preaching. So he was preaching for a long time before they finally killed him. But it depends, of course, the whole thing is on your view of these things, isn't it? So that is a little bit more opposition. So now the Catholics, who we started this lesson looking at how they have been brutally attacked, what did they do to oppose this? So some Catholics then start speaking out as well. So the one thing that Hitler's probably tried to do at the beginning of all of this was to control both religions. Well, this is a good example to show that he clearly didn't. In actual fact, all he did was unite both religions against the Nazis. So the Protestant opposition in the confessional church, and we've got some Catholics also speaking out. And 400 of these Catholics were sent to the priests' block at Dachau concentration camp. So a block, a special place in Dachau just for priests, and obviously they were executed there. So with those executions and the closing down of the schools, the Pope sends this letter, this burning anxiety letter, and it's read out in every Catholic church in the country, encouraging rebellion. So for those of you Year 11s watching this for the first time, remember the Elizabeth course, the papal bull that was sent in 1570, essentially encouraging English Catholics not to go to Elizabeth's Protestant church. In a weird sort of way, this is kind of similar, isn't it? This burning anxiety letter, or papal bull, was sent out, and it encouraged the Catholics in Germany to rebel against the Nazis. Of course, that just made Hitler even angrier and sped up his persecutions against the Catholics. But the Pope is clearly trying, and maybe you could argue that the Pope did a little bit too little too late, especially with the Concordat earlier on, but perhaps he had to believe and hoped that the Concordat would actually work. So then the Catholic youth groups, they continue in the countryside up until 1938. Remember, they were banned, so there's a little bit of opposition there. And of course, when we're thinking about opposition, we can think about the Edelweiss Pirates and the Swing Youth Group. So there was some youth opposition all over, but the Catholic youth groups continued in the countryside, obviously probably not in Berlin or the major cities. And then another famous Catholic cardinal, Galen, he criticised the T4 euthanasia programme, but Galen was far too popular and far too important as a cardinal, really high up in the Catholic Church, to be dealt with. And when we mean dealt with, to be executed. So Hitler was almost strapped a little bit what he could do with this Galen character, because he's saying it. And the T4 programme, as we know, where they killed children who had mental or physical disabilities, he just spoke out against it because it is a horrific thing. So what we're sort of seeing now, and let's just take a bit of a breather, just pause our minds a little bit on this story, this lesson, as we approach the end of it, is that we've ended up with two oppositions from Catholics and Protestants, which could suggest, couldn't it, that the Nazis failed to deal with religion. Or you could argue that although there was opposition, the Nazis dealt with it fairly effectively and swiftly. It's entirely up to you, and obviously that forms your argument today for a Section B, if it's Section B in your exam. Now, I accept there are better Section Bs, there are more fun or exciting Section Bs, but hopefully having gone through this lesson now, you can see that even religion as a Section B wouldn't be too bad. All right, so how far has he done this? Let's have a little check-in. So he's tried to work with the Christian churches, but instead he's effectively in conflict with both. He tried to make them both conform to Nazi ideas and failed. His Reich Church did, but then his Reich Church essentially fell apart as soon as the Confessionals Church was set up. The police and the law courts and the churches all became Nazified, so that's probably a good example of how they did manage to control them. But when we say church, only the Reich Church, because of course the Catholic Church didn't. And Germany is now moving closer as the sort of decade goes on, the 1930s, to this totalitarian proper dictator state where the government controls every part of the state. Reichstag, the party, the army, the police, the churches, the schools, and the law courts. Everything is controlled by the state or by Hitler. So that's what we're moving towards. I personally, if you're asking me, think that the churches did quite a good job of opposing the Nazis. I don't think the Nazis ever fully got to grip with controlling the churches. And then obviously World War II happened and they lost. Who knows if World War II would have went the other way and the Nazis won. Perhaps the churches wouldn't have stood much of a chance after 1945. But as it is, I feel like they never quite fully controlled religion, and maybe that's something you agree with, or maybe something you don't agree with, and again, that is really good practice for section B. So all we're going to look at now, we don't need to necessarily do anything with this, is just have a look at the dates so that we can see the order of how things happened during the 1930s. Obviously, depending on what the question is, you need to make sure that you just look at your exam paper and try and figure out, is this a just control of religious groups, or is this a how effective was opposition to religious groups? But these dates are essentially the story. It might be worth actually stopping this video now, or another time, maybe perhaps towards your Cold War paper or your paper 2, whichever one you do. It's just, even though this is paper 3 in the Germany paper, have a practice of a narrative question. So beginning, middle and end of the Nazi relationship with the churches, just as practice. And obviously that's a little bit curveball, but it's good practice, isn't it, to have those 3 paragraphs in chronological order. So when you're happy with the dates, or you've done something with them, maybe you made some flashcards perhaps, or if you're making some quiz questions, these are the kind of quiz questions that you probably need to know, especially that Concordat. It's easy because it's just as Hitler is elected in 1933, but it'd be useful to know when the Ministry of the Church was set up, when the Confessional Church was set up. But of course, as we always say, people get really worried and stressed about dates. As long as you're talking about the story, i.e. that Niemöller set up this church, but you don't quite get the date right, then you should be okay. All right, but just try to learn the dates if you can. So that's that lesson finished. That's religion finished. Thank you very much for that. Just rewind the video if you missed some bits, or you need to come and ask your teacher a bit more specific, or drop a comment, then feel free. So now let's step into this, and how does religion, or how might religion, this topic, look in your exam this summer? All right, or if you are not in year 11 when you do your exam. So firstly, it could be a 12 marker. I don't know if I'd like it as a 12 marker. I think it'd be quite difficult. I prefer section B, I think, because the sources and interpretations will give you a little bit of a prompt. But if you're really confident on the topic, then I think we're in a good place. So it could be, explain why the Nazis attempted to control society 1933, that should say, sorry, to 39. And it's given you one bullet point being religion, another bullet point being the police state, and of course it would say you must use a third of your own, which you could use propaganda. And in the religion paragraph, everything we've talked about so far in this lesson would be in there, wouldn't it? So quite nice in the sense that it would all be just in one paragraph, and you'd easily, you couldn't not get your 3 evidence or 3 facts in this paragraph, could you? Because it's all about religion. But remember, you're focusing on this question on how the Nazis controlled them. So the Reich Church, sending people, the priest to the priest block, arresting, closing down youth groups, things like that. So that's the stuff you need to be talking about, not necessarily the opposition. That's kind of what I'm trying to say to you in this lesson. Make sure you understand what it is the question needs from you. In this case, it's more so, what did the Nazis do to the churches, rather than what did the churches do to the Nazis. All right. It could be question 1, as we saw earlier, an inference question. So there could just be a source asking you to work out, or some support for the Nazis for a religious group, or whatever the question might be. It might say, what can you infer from source A about Nazi support or Nazi opposition from religious groups, whatever it might be. And with this sort of backstory in your mind, remember as well with question 1, you don't need any knowledge at all. You just read the thing, make sure you relate it to the question, and see what you think. More likely, and for some people maybe more scarily, what if it's section B? What if your whole Germany paper, all 36 marks of it, relates to religion, and you think, oh my God, literally. So let's break this down now for the last little bit of this lesson, how it might look as a section B. Okay, I'll give you some examples, and I'll give you some work to go away and maybe have a little look at. So remember, section B will all be about, in this case, religion. All 4 questions, We'll go along the theme of Nazi control of religion. So the first question is going to be our 8-marker, our source question, our COP, 2 COP paragraphs, exactly the same as paper 1 in the trenches. Remember, we are just literally copying the source. So we look at it and we think, right, so source B, this is the one we looked at earlier in this lesson. And we're going to just remind ourselves to COP, okay? If you can get a couple of quotes, if you can write quite quickly, it's always better to try and get a little bit extra in there. And a little bit more own knowledge than you need, but you as a minimum, must include some content backed up with some own knowledge and some provenance, which is always the bold statement at the top of a source. Who made it? When was it made? Why was it made? What is the source? Etc. Remembering as well, every time we're using this COP, that we're not just saying it is a statement in this case, we are saying why that makes it useful in relation to the inquiry. So the inquiry is into Nazi control. So maybe some examples, just a little bit of practice for you on this one, how this might look. So first of all, remember, we're going to make our judgment in our opening sentence that source B is very useful, incredibly useful, or slightly useful, whatever you might think. Source B is useful for this inquiry into Nazi control of religion. So we've made our judgment, we've told the examiner we think this source is useful. Then we want to pick out our content, don't we? So let's keep it simple. We'll say source B says we must show loyalty to the Führer who has saved us from communism and given us a better chance. So we've picked out that sentence. It's not a big source, so obviously it's really hard to maybe pick out anything other than that one. But we're talking about in terms of the inquiry into Nazi control. So we need to now add some knowledge that relates to the Nazi control and that quote that we've just picked out. All right, so we might say something like, this is useful because I know that the Protestants were fearful of communism taking over Germany as they would end religion. And so this source supports that fear. So we've said to the examiner, the quote we picked out, we've backed it up with some really relevant knowledge to the focus of the question. And I also know that 2/3 of Germany were Protestant. So this would suggest, it's always useful if you can get an inference into this question as well, that the Nazis had influenced and controlled at least the majority of Nazi Germany. So the fact that this source is quite positive into following the Nazis and the fact that we know that the Protestants are 2/3 of the country, you could quite clearly and quite safely infer from this source that they had controlled the majority. 2/3 is more than 1/3, isn't it, of the Catholics? So hopefully you can see there that our own knowledge there is quite focused and has a nice little inference in there as well. And we want to try and end this little paragraph, don't we, with our provenance, our example of provenance. Again, I say try and do 2 if you can, 2 of each, but you need 1 of each. But just make sure that they're good. All right. In this case, I've tried to get maybe a little bit of 1.5, maybe, but definitely enough to get our provenance mark. So source B is a statement, so that's what is the source, from a German Protestant church leader in 1937. Now, sometimes you'll just put full stop and you'll think you're done with your provenance, but you'll get no marks for that. You need to go on to say this is particularly useful for the inquiry as it was well into Hitler's reign, so clearly shows support. He is also a leader, so he will be familiar with the support within his own church. Okay, so hopefully you can see that I have took the provenance, what it is, even when it is, and I've tried to explain a little bit to the examiner why I think that makes it even more useful. All right, and the fact that I've said there this is particularly useful, it gives me an extra bit of judgment points there as well. Hopefully that makes sense, okay? So in real life, obviously you would then have source C to look at, a second paragraph. They don't need to link together. They don't need to be compared. And it would be the opposite of this in this case for section B. Remember that the sources will always be opposite so that they can match the interpretations later on. So there isn't going to be a source C in this case. I just want to get your idea, just thinking about it. But you could make up a source if you wanted to and write your second paragraph. But you could certainly, at the very least, as far as revision is concerned, just practice some thinking about some O knowledge, some of the O that you might bring in for the opposite of this, which would be, of course, that there was opposition, and that might be a source from Niemöller talking about the Confessionals Church or something like that. I don't know, anything you could make up, but it would be the opposite, wouldn't it? Then when we've spent our time on that, probably maybe 16 minutes maximum probably on that, we're going to go to question 3b. Which is going to be, what is the difference in the views of interpretation 1 and 2 about religious opposition to the Nazi regime? So we're just going to have a look at interpretation 1 for now, but you will know as well as you do in this one, what's the opposite view going to be, because interpretation 1 and 2 will always be opposite, okay, or different. So it might be one success, one fail. It might be one opposition, one not opposition. It might be one happy, one not happy. Whatever it is, it's always going to be the opposite. So keep that in mind, okay? Hopefully you're starting to get to that place now, especially if you are year 11 watching this for revision. We've done a lot of practice with section B. So I'll let you first of all pause this video and have a little read of this interpretation. Maybe write down in your book or in your Google Doc, wherever you do in your notes, what you think the view of interpretation 1 is. And then we'll have a look at a little model answer for what I've done for this. All right, so when you're ready, unpause, have a look at that, and then see if you are correct. So firstly, all right, we're going to say the view of interpretation 1 about religious opposition to the Nazi regime, because we're always focusing on the question, remember, is that opposition was quite weak. So I've worked out that I think this interpretation is saying that there wasn't much opposition at all. All right, then I'm going to say our script. I can tell this because it says, and I've picked out that quote, the churches offered less than fundamental resistance to Nazism. So that just means basic or standard basic, opposition. That proves to me that it was weak, if non-existent at all. Now, if we had interpretation 2 in front of us, then obviously it would suggest that there was more severe opposition, wouldn't it? You can make it up if you want. You can write your own interpretation if you want, and then finish the rest of this sentence. But it would be something like, whereas the view of interpretation 2 about religious opposition was that opposition was quite strong. So there's our opposite, weak and strong. And I can tell this because it says whatever you've made up in yours. And this is again another example of why section B shouldn't scare you, that you can just literally use what's in front of you, even if you're having an absolute brain fog. All right, so keep that in mind with that one, and maybe have a go at that. But it would definitely be opposite, wouldn't it? So that's, I think, where we're thinking about this for a sec. And then we will go on to question 3C, all right, which is going to be, why are interpretations 1 and 2 different? And that is our script, okay, our absolute script, based on different sources. So we've seen our interpretation now, we've seen our source. So before we do start, pause the video and just look at these two things together and ask yourself, do they match up? Use those skills. Does interpretation 1 and source B match up? And then come back and we'll have a look at maybe a little model answer of this. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you see that they probably do match up, don't they? Which would mean interpretation 2 would match up to source C in real life, wouldn't it? So our script on this one, remember, interpretations 1 and 2 have different views about religious opposition because they're based on different sources, 1 mark. Then we need to match them up, don't we? So I have said interpretation 1 is based on sources like source B, as they both suggest there was limited opposition. Interpretation 1 says they oppose Nazi interference in their church, but not Nazism. And source B talks about we must show loyalty to the Führer. So I've picked out one thing from each that is kind of similar, that shows that there was limited opposition. And then, of course, whereas interpretation 2 is based on sources like source C, as they both, and then pick out a quote from each of them that support the idea that there was lots of opposition. Hopefully that makes sense, but there we've now got 16 marks nailed, the source question, and then these 2 4s, ready for our big 20 marker, or 16 plus 4 spag. Question 3D. Now, again, you might think, oh, big essay, stress. But actually, as these essays go, this one is definitely my favourite. And hopefully you'll see now that it just sort of does itself, as long as you remember the technique. So here's our interpretation again. Now, in real life, this question would say, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about religious opposition to the Nazi regime? But in this little example that we're talking about, we're going to use 1 because that's the one that we're using. All right, it doesn't matter because you're essentially going to compare them both anyway. So that's our interpretation. You'll notice I've taken the source away. The examiner won't know, by the way, if you have used information from the sources. So just make sure that if you're having a bit of a content, brain freeze, have a quick read of the sources that you've just looked at already. So hopefully that would mean you wouldn't need to. But just if you get to this stage and you think, I can't remember anything, have a quick look at the source that would support interpretation 1 to maybe use that as your knowledge in this answer. But the quoting that you do and the content that you're picking out is from the interpretation, okay? So as always in the essays that asks you for your opinion, we need our judgment, we need our statement against the statement, sorry. So introduction is going to say, how far do you agree? So I might say, I agree to a much larger extent with interpretation 2 that there was huge opposition to the Nazi regime from religious groups. And then I'd give a little bit of reasoning for that, and I might say something like the fact that the Nazis had to get so extreme in their control would suggest that the opposition was good or was strong. Something like that. Hopefully that makes sense. But of course, this bit, just like the 16 markers in medicine and Elizabeth, when you give this thesis statement, this introduction, you're setting up essentially your train of thought. Now, what is really important that you do not do in this question is just write an essay about whether or not there was opposition or not to the from religious groups. This question is asking you to really work with the interpretations. You have to use the interpretations in your answer. So we are co-coing, no P, no provenance needed. Doesn't matter who wrote the interpretations, essentially. We just need to be worrying about the content. So we're going to pick out at least 2 sentences within each paragraph. So 4 in total, at least, from interpretation 1, interpretation 2. And then our own knowledge is much less important, but still needed. We have to back up those quotes, just like we do in the source question, directly in relation to the question. So we need to use really relevant knowledge that shows why there was or wasn't opposition, or why there was or wasn't strong opposition, at least. So that's just an aside before we get into the detail of what this might look like. So our intro's done, our judgment is made. So paragraph 1, it's easy, this one, because you just got to basically say in 2 strong paragraphs how interpretation 2 is correct and interpretation 1 is correct as well, regardless of what you think. It's irrelevant at this point. They're both correct because these historians have an opinion. They have formed an opinion through reading, sources, whatever they've done. They have formed an opinion about Nazi opposition from religious groups, and they have presented this opinion to you in this interpretation. So the first one we're going to look at, as I say, in real life it would be interpretation 2, but as we've only got one in this example, we'll go with that. So we're going to start with on the one hand, and I think I encourage you to do that because this is clearly a two-sided argument, or an argument that has 2 views. So on this hand, we're going to talk about the view of interpretation 1. And then paragraph 2 will be on the other hand. So that's going to nicely signpost to the examiner that we're going to move over to the other view. So we're going to start again by telling the examiner what the view of interpretation 1 is again. We know that, don't we, from question 3b, but it's not going to take you any time at all just to say the view of interpretation 1 about religious opposition to the Nazi regime is that there wasn't much opposition to the Nazis themselves, more so their interference in their church. And this is correct. That bit's important. So we're telling the examiner we acknowledge this interpretation's views are correct. And now we're going to talk about why they're correct, okay? So we're going to bring into that some quotes, 2 at least, from this interpretation. It's not a big interpretation, so chances are you're essentially going to break down this into two halves. Pick out the quote. So you're going to say interpretation 1 says, as we would do with the source question, and then back that up with relevant own knowledge that absolutely is relevant to the question. Don't go random onto something about breaking down the church youth groups if your quote isn't about opposition from Hitler Youth, from church youth groups. Make sure your knowledge really is specifically about the quote that you've picked out and the opposition to the Nazi regime. So you do that twice, all right? So Coco, if you like, get that in there. You must get your quotes in there. The quotes are more important than the own knowledge. If you get time for a third quote, all the better. Back it up as well. So there's no need for any provenance at all. But then what we need to do within this paragraph, if we can, try really hard to, is consider the tone of this interpretation. What's good about it? What does it include? Is it broad? Is it factual? Does it talk about, does this historian at least accept there was a problem or there was opposition, or is he just totally focused on his view and not mentioning the other side at all? Do you think that's a negative of the interpretation? Would you more value an interpretation that at least acknowledges the other side? Is it too emotional? Is the language emotional? Is it full of hyperbole? I don't know, whatever comes to mind. And as we've said in revising this thing, when we're thinking about tone and language, there could be a million possible observations you make. You just need to make a couple of ideas about how has this historian got his views across, and do you like that, or do you think it could be better? Did it need something else? Is it leaving something out that you think would really have helped? And of course, that's a little bit of your own knowledge there again, isn't it? But you're using that own knowledge in direct response to this question, not just an argument about whether or not you agree. So you might say, I think this would be a better interpretation if it at least said that there was some more opposition from, I don't know, Protestant church than the Catholics, but it doesn't. So that could be your little discussion, and that's your first paragraph then, all nice and done. We've got Coco, quote, knowledge, and we've considered the tone, we've considered the language of the interpretation, we've considered its positives and maybe it's some of its limitations, and then we literally go, on the other hand, for paragraph 2, the view of interpretation 2 is that there was much stronger opposition to the Nazis from religion, and is also correct, and then repeat, quote, knowledge, directly related to the opposition that the religious groups did do, and then again consider its tone and its language and how the historian has got their point across, pros and cons, limitations of the interpretation, if you like, a little bit. But generally speaking, why is this interpretation correct? And then your conclusion. This is where we've got to sort of summarize all of those things that we've just done in our 2 big paragraphs together. Once again, remind the examiner how you started your essay, how far you agree with interpretation 2 or 1, and just tell them why now in this conclusion, why do you prefer one of the interpretations more than the other? Obviously include a little bit of your thesis statement again, your historical knowledge as to perhaps why you agree more with one than the other in terms of history, the fact that they did have to get aggressive to deal with them shows that there was successful opposition, something like that. And then overall, was one of the interpretations just a bit more factual? Was it just a bit more broad? Was one of them just a little bit too vague for you? And when you say that, make sure you say why it was vague. Make sure you say what it needed to be better for you. And it doesn't need to be 6 million examples. Just pick out a couple of the things that you've said about your tone and language already in the paragraphs, and just conclude now, what was your clincher? What was it that made one of them you like one of them or agree more with one of them than the other? And then we're done. Okay, so this question alone is going to be at least half an hour. The other 3B and 3C, the 4 markers, maybe looking at 5 minutes each for that, and then maybe 15, 16 minutes for the source question. But give or take, we're looking at a good sort of, what's that, about an hour perhaps for section B, give or take a little bit, depending on how quick you write. But obviously section B is the priority for this paper. All right, so thank you very much for listening to this. Hopefully this has helped a little bit. What I suggest that you go away and do now is write this paragraph properly based on this lesson that you've watched, and hand it in to be marked. And you can't necessarily do paragraph 2 because there isn't another interpretation, but a good bit of revision would be to make up an interpretation, pretend you're a historian, and write a little interpretation about severe or strong opposition, and then do paragraph 2 and then conclusion, or get one of your friends to then write an interpretation and use theirs, or vice versa. You give one to them. That would really get your head around this. Okay, so overall a tricky topic, but hopefully this lesson has shown you that it's not entirely undoable. All right, so once again, as always, thanks for staying around, and hopefully this has proved helpful. Hand in any work that you need to, or if you have any questions, please just let your teacher know. All right, thank you, and we'll see you for the next video.